A century after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the nation which had managed to survive the Civil War faced a new challenge. The most contested and probably most corrupt presidential election in the nation's history. Full of accusations of and actual fraud, the results were so uncertain and contested that the impasse could only be met with unprecedented solutions. And those solutions had an enormous impact on and end an era of American history. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The elections after the Civil War proved that the divided nation was far from healed. Grant's 1868 victory was considered slim by contemporary observers. Black suffrage remained one of the most contentious issues, with Southern states hoping to suppress the vote on the state level. Grant supported suffrage for the freedmen, and he won a majority of their 500,000 votes. While Grant won handily in 1872, foreboding signs abounded. Arkansas and Louisiana's votes were thrown out due to irregularities. In 1874, President Grant sent troops to Louisiana to stamp out an armed uprising against the Republican government there. And in January of 1875, that commander seized the State House to expel Democrats and preserve a Republican majority. Grant's second term, however, was haunted by corruption, scandal, and the long depression which began after the Panic of 1873. Grant chose not to run for a third term, but it was unclear who would succeed him. In 1874, the Democrats had won control of the House for the first time since the Civil War, and set the stage for a very different election in 1876. The Republican convention struggled to find a candidate, with the popular James Blaine unable to secure a majority. Ultimately, Ohioan Rutherford B. Hayes was selected as a compromise, an affable but not especially charismatic character. Henry Adams, grandson of President John Quincy Adams and great-grandson of John Adams, said of Hayes that he is a third-rate nonentity whose recommendations are that he is obnoxious to no one. The Democrats chose Samuel Tilden, whose reform efforts contrasted against the corruption that plagued Grant's administration. As was traditional, neither candidate actively campaigned, but party operatives were active across the country. Both platforms focused on honesty and reform. Mudslinging was a common feature of the campaign. Tilden supporters lampooned Grant's scandals, while Republicans charged the Democrats as being the same in character and spirit as when it sympathized with treason, a tactic Democrats dismissed as waving the bloody flag. This was reflected in the candidates as well. Hayes was a Union veteran and was wounded 5 times during the war. After the war, he'd served as a representative from Ohio before being elected governor of that state and promised reform that he would only serve 1 term. Tilden was a longtime politician and lawyer from a wealthy New York family who had become a protege of Martin Van Buren. He supported the Union during the war and was known for having turned against the corrupt machinery of Tammany Hall. As governor of New York, he had publicly battled corruption, breaking up the Canal Ring. Opponents said Tilden was a drunkard who planned on using the presidency to pay off Southern debts, while others accused Hayes of stealing money from his fellow soldiers. Toward the end of the campaign, Republicans alleged that Tilden meant to secure federal pensions for Confederate soldiers and pay Southerners for property lost in the war. The Democratic House had, in fact, fired many of the House clerks and other officials and replaced them with Confederate veterans already. Fraud was rampant in 19th century elections. State machines regularly purchased votes, plied voters with food and drink, and regularly stuffed or tampered with ballot boxes. Floaters were people who voted for more than one party, while repeaters voted more than once. Some were even advised to cut their beards several times on election day so that they could pretend to be a new voter. Ballots were often public, and some even employed voice voting thanks to low literacy rates. Even during Reconstruction, the South saw serious incidents of voter suppression, with groups like the KKK and the Red Shirts using mob violence, lynching, and intimidation to keep African Americans from the polls. They would sometimes simply refuse to allow Republicans to put their ballot in the box, or would trick illiterate men into voting for the Democratic candidate. The Red Shirts and similar groups such as the White League used violence liberally. In Louisiana, the White League forced 6 Republican office holders to resign in 1874, and then killed them, along with a number of freedmen. That same year, White League members actually routed 3,500 police and militia and seized the Louisiana State House. In the Carolinas, red shirts employed intimidation and violence, wearing red shirts as an implicit threat. In 1876, the Democratic organizer in South Carolina required his supporters to wear red shirts at party functions. One anti-Reconstruction historian estimated that 150 African Americans were killed in South Carolina during the campaign. Years afterwards, a red shirt leader would say that we went to battle. It was then that we shot them. It was then that we killed them. It was then that we stuffed ballot boxes. November 7th, 1876, Election Day was generally quiet, but voting across the country, and especially the South, was corrupted by enormous and determined efforts to win the election unfairly, by both sides. By the evening of Election Day, however, things were looking grim for Hayes, so grim that the party chairman had taken a bottle of whiskey to bed. But in New York City, the controversial Daniel Sickles stopped by a depressed and nearly empty Republican national headquarters to examine the returns. Though Tilden had a large lead, Sickles noticed that if 3 particular close states held to Hayes, he would become president by a single electoral vote. Sickles sent telegrams under the names of the absent party chairman. With your state sure for Hayes, he is elected. Hold your state. November 8th was a day of mixed celebration. The Buffalo Courier read, "Glory, Tilden triumphant," while the New York Times said, "Results still uncertain." This was thanks to reports from those states that Sickles had sent telegrams to the night before: Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, as well as Oregon. The results in all 4 states were already in dispute. The vote counts were incredibly close, with South Carolina going to Hayes by less than 1,000 votes, Florida to Tilden by only 100, and Louisiana to Tilden by 6,000 votes. Oregon was a special case. Hayes had clearly won the state, but one of the chosen electors was a postmaster, and the Constitution says electors cannot be government employees. Though he resigned, the Democratic governor replaced him with a Tilden elector. Though Tilden seemed to have won the popular vote with a solid majority of 250,000 votes, the electoral count was undecided. 185 votes were needed to win, and without the disputed states, Tilden had 184 to Hayes's 165, with 20 in dispute. Almost immediately, party operatives were sent to the 3 southern states to examine the counts and influence them in any way they could. Hayes and Tilden stayed out of the growing fray. Hayes, believing that he'd lost, wrote that he could remain in Columbus, where the cousins and friends live. Newspapers across the country were declaring for one or the other and stoking controversies, with selling papers faster than hotcakes. Reports were conflicting, with a shouting multitude rushing to Hayes when at one point a claim came in that Tilden had lost his home state of New York. It was an important election. A record 81% of eligible voters had voted. But of course there were legitimate issues with the counts. In South Carolina, more than 100% of eligible voters had somehow voted, and it was no secret that intimidation and outright fraud were rampant. Governments in all 3 states were in limbo as candidates from both parties claimed to be the legitimate elected government. But the early returns meant little. All 3 southern states had to have those tallies reviewed by returning boards, which were all controlled by Republicans, who had the power to throw out votes if they deemed them fraudulent. One Republican dashed south with a letter to Hayes saying he meant to aid in preventing our being defrauded of what we have fairly won. Well, Hayes believed that the southern states were carried with fraud and violence by Democrats, and that if the election had been fair, he would have won both the Electoral College and the popular vote. He feared that contesting the results might cause further issues. Indeed, the country was awash in talk of a possible Second Civil War, and President Grant ordered several regiments secretly into D.C. to maintain order. Even while Republican agents were throwing down with Democrats by whatever means necessary, Hayes insisted he wanted no taint of dishonesty in canvassing the votes. In Florida, one historian wrote, it was impossible to determine who would have won a fair election. Democratic ballots with Republican insignia abounded, and rural areas had the results delayed and altered if necessary. Lew Wallace, writer of Ben-Hur and a Civil War veteran, went to Florida at Hayes's behest and was dismayed at what he saw. Nothing is so common as the resort to perjury, unless it is violence. If we win, our methods are subject to impeachment for possible fraud. If the enemy win, it is the same thing exactly. Though Tilden was as concerned about honesty as Hayes, Tilden's nephew, William Pelton, was trying to buy off members of the returning boards. In South Carolina, 2 counties' votes were invalidated, handing the state to Hayes and the state government to Republicans. The Democrats set up a rival government. In Louisiana, J. Madison Wells, chair of the returning board, likely negotiated for a payment from his own party to compete with the offer from Tilden's nephew. 15,000 votes, 13,000 of them Democratic, were thrown out. The returning board from Florida reported Hayes the winner as well. On December 6th, when the states officially cast their ballots, all 4 disputed states saw electors from both parties attempt to have their votes recorded. Now more wrinkles face the nation. The Constitution says that Electoral College votes be directed to the President of the Senate, who shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and all the votes shall then be counted. But who exactly decided which votes to count when conflicting votes arrived? To make the situation worse, the President of the Senate is the Vice President. However, there was no Vice President, as Henry Wilson had died in 1875. The acting Senate president was Republican Thomas Ferry, who chose to sidestep the issue and refused to make the decision. Democrats largely thought all of Congress should vote on the issue, secure that they had the majority. Meanwhile, all kinds of politicians worked behind the scenes to jockey their way into a commanding position. Roscoe Conkling, a New York Republican, disliked Hayes and approached Tilden surreptitiously. Another man claimed that he had 36 Democratic votes in the House that could support Hayes if the South was given home rule and the last federal troops were removed, while others suggested promising money to the Texas and Pacific Railroad to earn Southern votes. To solve the issue, committees proposed something unprecedented to decide the election: an electoral commission to have 5 representatives, 5 senators, and 5 members of the Supreme Court. The commission would be evenly split between Democrats and Republicans, with the 5th Supreme Court member to be an independent chosen by the justices of the court, expected to be David Davis, who would then decide the election. Democrats were especially supportive of the commission, but opposition was rife as well. Tilden supported it, though he didn't, and Hayes came around to it after first complaining that it was a surrender. A final bit of intrigue threw everything back in the air. Davis, in addition to being a Supreme Court justice, was then running on the Greenback Party for the Senate in Illinois. Tilden's nephew, Pelton, suggested giving Davis Democratic support, which would earn him the Senate seat that he had no chance at otherwise getting. Pelton believed that he was purchasing Davis's support, but it was a colossal miscalculation. Davis refused to serve on the commission since he was taking the Senate seat. He was replaced by Justice Joseph Bradley, a Republican. From then, the results were never especially in doubt. Though Democrats argued that the returning board's conclusions should be ignored, the votes in the commission went straight along party lines, giving Hayes the votes 8-7 each time. It is possible, though not universally agreed, that a backroom and unwritten deal among congressmen, called the Compromise of 1877, actually decided the election. Democrats continued to try and halt the official count through filibustering techniques, which lasted until March 2nd, only 2 days before the presidential inauguration. The compromise stated that the last federal troops would leave the South, one Southern Democrat would be appointed to the cabinet, a Texas and Pacific Railroad would be built, and money would be given to the South to revitalize its economy. The North would let the South deal with African Americans as they desired. But it isn't universally accepted that the deal really happened. Hayes had already advocated for Southern home rule and promised to appoint a Southerner to his cabinet. Additionally, he did not provide money to the South for its economy, nor back the Texas Pacific Railroad. Hayes was confirmed formally at 4:10 a.m. on March 2nd. After all the shouting and arguing, Hayes was officially inaugurated on March 5th, 1877. Peacefully, although angry Democrats referred to him as your fraudulency. He removed federal troops from the South, appointed a Southern Democrat to his cabinet, and then pretty much carried on like normal. Tilden never contested the election. The Southern states threw out their Republican governments, installed their own, and proceeded to do anything and everything they could think of to disenfranchise the African American vote and vocally support racist and segregationist policies that would continue into the 1960s. Officially, Hayes won by a single electoral vote, 185 to 184, the closest decision in Electoral College history. The 1876 election and extraordinary methods used to resolve that election profoundly affected American politics and drew many of the lines that would define the parties through much of the next century. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.